Sarah sat in her favorite cafe, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. She wasn't focused on the aroma of the freshly brewed drink or the comforting hum of chatter around her. Her mind was somewhere else, replaying the latest incident with her colleague, David. He had a way of making her feel small, often belittling her ideas in meetings and masking it with a smile. Sarah had grown tired of feeling trapped by his toxic behavior, but today was different. She had a plan. "You know what they say," her friend Mia said, leaning in over the table. "You can't control other people's actions, but you can control how you respond." Mia's words hung in the air as Sarah nodded. She had heard the advice before, but for the first time she was ready to take it seriously. Instead of feeling powerless, Sarah was determined to take control. "I'm done letting him push me around," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to flip the script." The next morning, Sarah walked into the office with a quiet sense of resolve. Her plan wasn't about confrontation or drama. It was about control. As she approached her desk, she noticed David hovering nearby. He greeted her with his usual smugness. "Late again, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Sarah smiled slightly, refusing to bite. She stayed calm, remembering the first trick Mia had taught her. Toxic people thrive on reactions, and David was no different. But today, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I actually got here early," she replied, her voice neutral. "But thanks for checking in." She turned away without waiting for his response, heading straight to her tasks. David stood there, momentarily thrown off. The usual spark of frustration he expected didn't come. Later that day, the team gathered for a meeting. As usual, David began speaking over Sarah the moment she voiced her opinion. In the past, she would have backed down, letting him take the lead. But not today. "David," she said, her voice firm but polite. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let me finish my point." She held his gaze, and for the first time, he seemed unsure how to respond. There was a pause in the room, and Sarah could feel everyone waiting. David shifted in his seat, but Sarah didn't look away. Setting boundaries was uncomfortable, but necessary. "Sure," he muttered, leaning back. Sarah finished her point, feeling a sense of victory, not over David, but over herself. As the days passed, David's behavior didn't magically change overnight. He still tried his usual tricks, like making snide comments or fishing for personal details. But Sarah had another strategy up her sleeve. She began to employ the gray rock method, becoming emotionally unresponsive whenever he tried to get a rise out of her. "So, how was your weekend? Must have been pretty dull, huh?" he said one afternoon, trying to pry into her life. "Fine," she answered flatly, without elaboration. She didn't engage, didn't offer anything for him to latch onto. The conversation fizzled out quickly, leaving David frustrated. It was like trying to poke a rock. There was nothing to gain. One afternoon, David cornered her near the coffee machine, launching into yet another self-centered monologue. "You know, Sarah, you should really speak up more in meetings. It's not like people notice when you're quiet." Sarah smiled internally. He was baiting her, but instead of rising to the challenge, she decided to use reverse psychology. "You're right, David," she said lightly. "I guess I'll just sit back and let you handle the next one. You're clearly much better at it." David blinked, not sure how to respond. The wind had been taken out of his sails, and Sarah walked away, feeling the upper hand shift. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued to maintain emotional distance. She no longer shared personal details or allowed David's words to affect her. Their conversations became increasingly one-sided, with David often struggling to keep her engaged. At lunch one day, Mia noticed the change. "You're different now," she remarked. "It's like he can't get to you anymore." Sarah nodded. "I've realized that the less emotional energy I give him, the less control he has over me. He's like a broken compass, always pointing in the wrong direction, trying to throw me off course. But I don't need to follow his lead." One afternoon, David was particularly insistent on interrupting Sarah during a project discussion. Instead of getting frustrated, she decided to mirror his behavior. calmly but intentionally. Each time he interrupted, she interrupted him back with the same tone he used. "David, I'm speaking right now, just like you were," she said, mimicking his rhythm without the aggression. It was subtle but effective. He seemed confused by her sudden shift in behavior. The mirroring threw him off, and by the end of the meeting, he had quieted down significantly. In a team discussion, David brought up a negative comment about a colleague's idea, trying to steer the conversation into a critique. But Sarah saw it coming. Instead of letting the negativity spread, she quickly redirected the conversation. "I think what's great about that idea," Sarah began, "is how it can open up new possibilities for our project." Her positivity was contagious, and soon the rest of the team was adding their own constructive thoughts. David's attempt to drag down the conversation failed, and Sarah could sense his growing frustration. A few days later, David tried one last tactic. "You seem to think you're better than everyone else now," he sneered during a lunch break. Instead of defending herself, Sarah simply smiled. "I think we all have our strengths, David," she said calmly, "and I'm focusing on mine." Her refusal to get defensive left David speechless. He had expected a confrontation, but Sarah's response had given him nothing to work with. The final shift came when Sarah decided to hold David accountable. After another passive-aggressive comment, she turned to him calmly. "David, I've noticed you've been saying things that undermine my contributions. Can you explain what you mean by that?" Her tone wasn't aggressive, just curious. David faltered. Faced with the truth of his behavior, he stammered, offering excuses. But Sarah didn't need to argue. She had already won by holding him accountable without getting drawn into his games. In the months that followed, David's behavior changed. Not completely, but significantly. He no longer targeted Sarah with his toxic tactics, and while she couldn't control how he treated others, she had taken back her power. Like Mia had said, Sarah couldn't control his actions, but she had mastered her response, and in doing so, she had taught him a lesson without saying a word.